Africa's economic disadvantage in global trade is a direct result of historical exploitation, unfair trade agreements, and the dominance of Western corporations. Hello and welcome back to One Africa Show, where we continue to bring forward the issues that matter most to the future of Africa. I'm your host, Patrick Newman, and today we continue our essential series, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation. This series is all about ensuring Africa takes its rightful place in global conversations and decision-making. Today, we're diving into a topic that is at the heart of Africa's economic challenges, the economic disadvantage, Africa's struggle for fair trade. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to remind you to subscribe, like, and share this video. By doing so, you're helping spread awareness and contributing to the conversation about Africa's future. And don't forget to stay tuned for the release of our upcoming book, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation, which takes an even deeper dive into these issues. Now, let's get started. Today's topic, the economic disadvantage. Africa's struggle for fair trade addresses one of the most pressing challenges that Africa faces today: unfair trade agreements and their detrimental effects on African economies. For too long, African nations have been forced into trade relationships that benefit industrialized countries while limiting Africa's ability to grow and diversify its economy. The legacy of colonialism, compounded by modern economic policies imposed by powerful global entities, has left African nations at a significant disadvantage in the global economic system. One of the biggest challenges facing Africa in global trade is the imposition of unfair trade agreements. Many African nations enter deals with Western powers or multinational corporations that set conditions which prioritize foreign interests over the local economies of African countries. Take, for example, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. While it offers African countries preferential access to U.S. markets, it also imposes conditions that force these nations to align their policies with U.S. foreign interests and economic priorities. Similarly, the Economic Partnership Agreements, EPAs, between the European Union and African nations have been heavily criticized. These agreements require African countries to open their markets to European goods, but restrict their ability to develop their own industrial sectors. This means African nations are stuck exporting raw materials, such as oil, minerals, and agricultural products, while being forced to import finished products at much higher costs. The consequences of these unfair trade agreements are severe. African countries remain largely dependent on exporting raw materials while importing finished products from industrialized nations. This dependency not only stifles industrialization, but also perpetuates economic vulnerabilities. African nations continue to serve as providers of raw materials for the global market, limiting their ability to diversify their economies and achieve sustainable growth. Instead of building economies that can stand on their own, these trade agreements keep Africa in a perpetual state of economic subordination. Now, let's take a look at the dominance of Western corporations in African markets. For decades, multinational corporations have extracted vast wealth from the continent, but they've provided limited benefits to local populations. Companies control key industries such as mining, agriculture, telecommunications, and retail, securing exclusive contracts and reaping substantial profits at the expense of African businesses and workers. Take the extractive industries as a prime example. Companies like Shell, Total, and Anglo American operate in countries like Nigeria, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, extracting billions in revenue from Africa's natural resources. But what do local populations get in return? They suffer from environmental degradation, poor working conditions, and a lack of reinvestment into local communities. Weak regulatory frameworks and corrupt governance structures enable these corporations to avoid paying fair taxes, robbing African governments of essential revenue needed for development. This dominance also extends into agriculture. Multinational agribusinesses such as Monsanto and Cargill control seed markets across the continent. They force African farmers to rely on expensive genetically modified seeds and pesticides, increasing production costs and reducing farmers' independence. This system effectively marginalizes small-scale farmers, making it difficult for them to compete both locally and internationally. The retail and consumer goods sectors are similarly dominated by Western corporations. Major multinational chains control African urban markets, often pushing out locally owned businesses and making it harder for African manufacturers to establish strong domestic industries. This results in capital flight, where profits generated in Africa are repatriated to corporate headquarters in Europe or North America, rather than reinvested into local economies. Another major factor contributing to Africa's economic disadvantage is the role of international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions wield significant influence over African economic policies through mechanisms like structural adjustment programs, SAPs, and loan conditions. Historically, their policies have focused on prioritizing debt repayment and market liberalization over social development and industrial growth. In the 1980s and 1990s, SAPs mandated by the IMF forced many African governments to implement austerity measures, privatize state-owned enterprises, and cut public spending on healthcare, education, and social services. While these programs were intended to stabilize African economies, they often led to increased poverty, economic stagnation, and even greater dependency on foreign aid. The withdrawal of government support from key industries left African economies vulnerable to the volatility of global markets, making them more susceptible to external economic shocks. The World Bank has also played a role in shaping African economies in ways that benefit multinational corporations. Infrastructure projects funded by the World Bank often prioritize foreign investment and ownership, allowing Western companies to dominate African markets while limiting local participation. The emphasis on foreign direct investment, FDI, as a development strategy has led to Africa's resources being controlled by external entities rather than being harnessed for national development. Despite these challenges, there are clear strategies African nations can adopt to overcome these economic disadvantages and regain control over their trade and economic future. Here are several key strategies for achieving economic independence and sustainable trade. 1. Strengthening regional trade and economic integration. One of the most effective ways to counter unfair trade agreements is by strengthening intra-African trade. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, are crucial in reducing trade barriers among African countries. AFCFTA can foster greater economic collaboration, increase industrialization, and create larger markets for African goods and services. By enhancing regional value chains and prioritizing local manufacturing, Africa can reduce its dependency on raw material exports and boost the competitiveness of its industries. 2. Promoting industrialization and value addition. African governments must focus on industrializing the continent. Rather than exporting raw commodities, African nations should invest in facilities that refine, manufacture, and process products locally. This would generate employment, create value-added products, and increase revenue. Diversification into industrial sectors will position Africa as a key player in global production, moving beyond its role as a resource provider. Third, encouraging investment in locally owned enterprises. To reduce the dominance of Western corporations, African nations should implement policies that support local businesses and entrepreneurs. Providing access to financing, technological resources, and market opportunities can help African enterprises compete on a more level playing field with multinational companies. Public-private partnerships should involve local stakeholders to ensure African ownership and control of key sectors. Fourth, reforming international financial policies. African nations must advocate for reforms in the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to ensure fair representation and more equitable lending policies. Increased African voting power within these institutions will help shift the focus from debt-driven models to development-oriented strategies. Additionally, Africa should explore alternative funding sources through regional development banks and sovereign wealth funds to reduce reliance on Western financial institutions. 5. Leveraging technology and digital trade. The rise of digital economies presents Africa with an opportunity to bypass some of the traditional economic constraints. By expanding e-commerce, fintech, and digital payment systems, African nations can facilitate trade and investment while reducing dependency on Western financial intermediaries. Technology hubs and startups should be supported to position Africa as a global leader in the digital economy. In conclusion, Africa's economic disadvantage in global trade is a direct result of historical exploitation, unfair trade agreements, and the dominance of Western corporations. However, by focusing on regional integration, industrialization, supporting local businesses, and reforming financial policies, Africa can build a more equitable and prosperous future. The continent can take control of its economic destiny, free from the constraints of unfair trade practices and external control. Thank you for joining me today on One Africa Show. Remember to subscribe, like, and share this video. And don't forget to stay tuned for the release of our book, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation. Let's work together to ensure that Africa's story is told on its terms and that its future is shaped by Africans for Africans.